Yes. Okay, we are ready for the session. I would like to introduce Ambassador Nelly Feroci, that has been an Italian ambassador for many years, but he has also been a commissioner of the European Union, and he will be the moderator of our session. The floor is, sì, 4:30. Professor, can you hear us? Professor Bergman, can you hear us? Okay, thank you very much.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this seminar conversation organized by the Festival della Diplomazia. It's a pleasure for me to chair and moderate this panel. The subject of this afternoon session is European defense. The exact title is Europe's Awakening and the Need for Common Defense. Let me say a few words of introduction, and then I'll move to ask some questions to our speakers. First, I would like to say that European defense is not a new item in the agenda of the European Union. It has been an important subject at the very beginning of the process of European integration with the Treaty on Defense, which established the common European defense community back in 1954, which was rejected by the French National Assembly. And that decision by the National French Assembly, in fact, amounted to a long, very long period of time when the word defense was not even allowed in the conversation in the European Union. And it's only back in 1999 that on the basis of an agreement between France and the United Kingdom, the idea that within the Union we should be able to develop some form of common capabilities in the field of defense was resuscitated, if I may say so. And from there on, there have been several attempts, more or less successful, probably less than more. But now we are in a situation where, in the present conjuncture, the idea that the European Union should develop a defense dimension or defense policy is back on the stage, if I may say so, due to a series of developments which I would like very briefly to quote. First, the awareness that the number of challenges that are for the European security is enormous, and they have increased exponentially in the recent past, including the dimension of these so-called hybrid threats, threats that are not only necessarily military threats. And this was one first element, but more recently, at least in these last few months, two new developments have brought the subject of a common defense back in the agenda of the European Union. The first one was the disastrous withdrawal of Western forces, American, but not only American, from Afghanistan, and the consequent assumption that the US will not provide security guarantees for its European allies everywhere in the world, and that the stance by the American administration, more isolationist, more concentrated on a domestic agenda, is clearly perceived also in Europe. And the second wake-up call of the decision of the Americans to go ahead with the supply of nuclear submarines to Australia in a move which was not a subject of consultation with European allies. So if there was a need to reopen a conversation, to restart a process aimed at creating a defense dimension in the Union, certainly there is the awareness not only that threats are numerous and different in nature, but also that we Europeans can only count on the American security guarantees to a certain extent. And we will hear more on that from our panelists this afternoon. I'm not particularly confident that progress will be at hand in the short term. I think it's going to be a long process before actually the Europeans will be able to develop a defense dimension. And the problems are numerous in that respect. But I don't want to say more on that. I would like simply to list the names and the CVs shortly of our speakers, of our panelists this afternoon. And I will start with Max Bergman, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, a think tank, important think tank based in Washington, DC, close to the Democratic Party. Mr. Bergman has been also a State Department official for quite some time. After Mr. Bergman, I would like to quote Teresa Corratella. She's project manager at ECFR. ECFR is an important think tank which has also a seat and an office in Rome. And Teresa Corratello is in the office in Rome. Vincenzo Camporini, who is not only a scientific advisor of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, which I have the honor to chair, but has also been chief of staff of the Italian defense in the past. And last but not least, my very good friend, Lorenzo Vai. Lorenzo is an Italian diplomat working at the policy planning unit at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but he has also been a researcher in the Istituto Affari Internazionali. So, Mr. Brenner, I would like to start with you. You can give us an idea of what are the perceptions in Washington about this attempt, they're not new, but this attempt of the Europeans to create a defense dimension, please.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's a shame that I can't be there in person, but it looks like you're having a fantastic event and conference. I really appreciated your introduction and starting off with the European defense community, because I think it's important to note in that conversation, the United States played an incredibly constructive role. It was John Foster Dulles, who was then the Secretary of State, a Cold War hawk, that strongly pushed European governments to sign up for the European defense community. The United States was sort of all bought in the concept of a common European defense capability. And then, I think you can contrast that, as you mentioned, with the St. Malo Declaration in 1999 between the UK and France, this sort of breakthrough agreement where the EU would create a 60,000 strong rapid reaction force. Well, just days later at a NATO summit, Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, gave a pronouncement which sort of outlined 3 US red lines for what EU defense would look like. And this was sort of the famous no duplication of NATO. And I think in the 20 years since, the United States has adopted that approach in a very rigid setting. So anything the EU sort of tried to do, the US would strongly oppose. And I think, fortunately, I think the time is sort of shifting on that, at least in Washington. I think one of the things that has become most apparent in the first year of the Biden administration is that the United States is sort of completing its pivot to Asia. Now, I think after 9/11, we had sort of firmly pivoted away from Europe, that Europe, which was the focus of US foreign policy in the 1990s, sort of ceased to be that. The focus was on the Middle East, on counterterrorism. But effectively, our focus was on Europe's neighborhood. When President Obama announced sort of the rebalance to Asia, or the pivot to Asia, the United States still was engaged in Europe's region, engaged in the Middle East. But now I think have not only sort of pivoted to Asia, but have pivoted away from Europe's region, focused more, much less on the Middle East, much less on counterterrorism, and much more on geopolitical competition with China. And I think the overriding sense is a degree of exhaustion when it comes to dealing with Europe and European security, in part because I think the United States has felt like it has banged its head against the wall, urging Europeans to spend more on defense, and with not much, frankly, to show for it, even though that defense spending has increased over the last few years. And so as such, I think the introduction was quite spot on, that America will be there for Europe to when Europe faces existential threats. So the threat from Russia, the United States will ensure that Europe is protected if faced with a peer-to-peer competitor or rival that really threatens European security. So the Article 5 commitment, I think, remains in place. But then you have all these other areas and issues that don't necessarily involve, an existential threat to European security, whether it's events in Syria or in North Africa and the Sahel, and issues where Europe may want to take action, such as in Afghanistan, if to get EU citizens out or to protect EU citizens. The United States is not necessarily going to be there to do it. And so I think what we've seen is sort of a separation of European, US and European security priorities aren't necessarily the same anymore. And the whole foundation, I think, of the post-Cold War or the post-World War II presumption of European security is that US and European security interests were totally aligned. And let me just make sort of one final comment, is that I think what we're seeing now from the Biden administration is an openness to sort of rethink how European security is structured. Now, we strongly believe in the importance of NATO, but if the EU is able to take action to develop real capabilities, and this is what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said when he recently traveled to Europe, into Brussels, that, okay, what is the EU's plan on defense? And instead of sort of debating concepts of strategic autonomy, let's sort of look at, give the United States something really concrete to react to. And I think there's actually real momentum in a potential for EU defense over the next few months. I think one of the benefits of the AUKUS affair is suddenly the US realized that it actually had to focus on European concerns, had to re-engage France, had to re-engage Brussels and re-engage Europe. And I think that's happening. But I think there's a real potential for action when it comes to EU defense with the summit that's going to happen next year, because the United States has suddenly realized that if the EU is serious about this, then why not support it? And US opposition to EU defense, I think, has been taken for granted, and has been a huge obstacle to any progress occurring. And I think that is now softening, and now the ball is effectively in the EU's court to come up with something real and tangible. I'll leave it at there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Brendan. Thank you also for your straightforwardness, if I may say so, when in particular quoting a concept which is very controversial in Europe as well, that of strategic autonomy. I wonder whether Teresa Coratelli could tell us her point of view on this notion, concept, idea, which has been, as I said, the subject of discussion. It's not easily accepted everywhere in all European capitals, and sometimes there have been too many misunderstandings around it. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I would like to thank the organizers and our audience for being again here. It's my second panel during this year edition of the festival. And what I have to say, it's nice to interact and talk with you with such a topic. I would like to start from the title of this panel, The Geopolitical Awakening and Common Defense. The word awakening, it's a kind of great interest for us as experts and people who work in this field. We try to use this word every time a big crisis hit us and hit our politics. We use the word awakenings during the financial crisis, and we saw a big reaction by the EU and by other international actors. We use the word awakening during the migration crisis, where suddenly Europe found out that migration was not a crisis, but a phenomenon, which is a kind of structural one. We use the word awakening with the COVID pandemic. I mean, what Europe managed to do with his plan, the recovery plan, which was something that we never experienced since the end of the Second World War, was a kind of awakening. We use this word also with the Green Deal and the plan that Europe put in place to deal with this phenomenon, which we consider a crisis in all its aspects. What I kind of miss is the use of the word awakening when we talk about security and defense, and we talk about the role Europe can play as a multilateral actor also in this field. Why I say this, and I hope my fellow colleagues in this panel won't mind if I'm a little bit more critical on that. I don't see still this awakening call for Europe with regards to security and defense, and this is for several reasons. Internal, so domestic, as well as external one. We all know, and you know, we have the importance of our strategic partnership with the US is still there. The transatlantic pillar remains one of the key pillars around which Europe works and set its agenda and work plan for the years to come. However, I'm sure that some of us at the moment, because of what Ambassador said, although I don't mean to undermine the importance of the strong tie between Brussels and Washington, I'm sure that some of us have some doubts regarding what to expect from the US in the years to come. The second issue is, of course, NATO. We strongly believe in NATO, and alongside with the transatlantic ties, NATO remains our pillar, and we should all work in order to strengthen this. So we have the multilateral and regional important strand. But then if we look at Europe, and I'm sorry to see that here again, like on many other crises, sometimes we have still too many visions. We have 27 visions, and sometimes we still lack in speaking with that famous one voice that for years we were advocating for. But I don't want to put all the burden on Europe and our European leaders, because we also have very challenging and difficult partners and neighbors to talk to. I use the word partner, but maybe today in these difficult times for several reasons, not only for the effects of the COVID pandemic, we might rather call them interlocutor. And in this case, I talk about Russia, for example, and talk about Turkey. Why I'm mentioning Russia and Turkey? Because the way we interact and dialogue with them has direct consequences on EU internal political dynamics and equilibrium. For example, if I think about Turkey, we know that some member states fear and have some particular sensitivities towards this actor. If I talk about Russia, and it is the same for other member states and other European capital. And one last very point, why we all sometimes miss to consider and involved in this exercise the very core of our European society, which is European citizens. And I close my short speech by making this question. Are we sure that as people working in this field and people who interact with policymakers and stakeholders working in this field are doing our best to dialogue with citizens and communicate to them in the most effective way what is the sense of the European defense and security for Europe. I'm sure that after the financial crisis, the migration one, although I don't want to call it a crisis, and COVID, at the top of European citizens' mind, we can find for sure economic recovery, health security. These are today the very big topics that are at the core of European citizens' thinking and at the core of how they look at Europe. And I'm not sure that defense and security are perceived in the same way that we, who are very privileged to work in this field, look at them, look at it in a very different way, like a further step towards a deeper European integration and toward a deeper collaboration with our major partner and interlocutors. Thank you.
It's working, yeah. Thank you also for reminding us what are probably the priorities and the sentiments of our public opinions. Now, on this point, which has to do with the limits and conditions of the possibility of developing a European defense dimension, I'd like to ask Enzo Camporini if he can develop on this concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for spending your attention in listening to our words. A few weeks ago, I had to talk about the same issues in Poland, in a seminar in Poland. It was just in the wake of the Afghanistan disaster. And the question was, can the world still rely on the US? Can we still, Europeans, rely on the US? Will they be ready to defend us? I wanted, in that occasion, to reverse the question. Can still the US rely on Europe? And my answer is not so sure. First of all, because Europe is a non-entity in defense, for sure. In political terms, it's a very strong entity in economic world, in the commercial world, in the industrial world, but not in policy and defense. You see, when we talk about defense, we consider at the beginning the concept of the European army, which is Army, Air Force, and Navy, of course. And it is sometimes difficult to remind us that these elements, these components of a society are just the instrument of foreign policy. Foreign policy is made of many instruments: diplomatic, political, economical, and military. But it is the instrument. So you cannot build the instrument if you do not have a common foreign policy. If you do not have common objectives to reach in order to be able to use all the instruments you need. We had so many examples in the past of failures, because the idea of putting together our resources in order to have a better output of the resources we spend on defense is not new. I recall in 1997, 96, 97, there was a decision by the governments of France, Portugal, and Spain, and Italy to put together a ground force, a land force. It was called Eurofor. The headquarters was in Florence, and it was a very effective thing, capable of managing land forces up to a division level. Then we had the crisis in Kosovo, and NATO was engaged, and the nations were engaged, and there was a kind of rotation of troops and rotation of elements in order to be able to manage the situation on the ground. And for 6 months, EUROFOR was employed with great results. Everybody was happy. We are doing the right thing, and we will continue on that. And the nations were investing so much money, so much resources, personal resources, intellectual resources, in order to make it better. A couple of years later, it was again the turn of EUROFOR to be employed in Kosovo. But unfortunately, a couple of weeks before the deployment, Kosovo declared unilaterally its independence. One of the nations of the EUROFOR was Spain. And you can understand how sensitive is Spain about the concept of secession. Look at what happens in Catalonia. Is something which is still going on. Therefore, the government of Madrid posed a veto to employ EUROFOR in Kosovo. Kosovo demonstrated that a common force without a common objective is useless. After a few years of discussion and effective efforts to keep the thing together, we decided to disband it. This was a really clear example that we have to put together our foreign policy towards a common objective in order to be able to establish a common instrument, which is absolutely necessary. I mean, when I asked the question in the beginning, can the US rely on the Europeans? They cannot, because the operational capabilities of the single European countries put together are not up to what is needed. And they can be up to what is needed only if, of course, there are more investment, more money into the system, but all the costs are spent in a better way, in a more effective way, which can be done only by eliminating all the duplications we have. Today we have 27 general defense staff, 27 operational centers. You can imagine how much money and resources are spent and wasted this way. So if we want to have a role, we have to put together our individual view to get a view common to everybody, and then we are able to be listened by the US. Is this possible? Very difficult. Think of what is the perception of risk in Tallinn, in Estonia, and the same thing in Rome or in Greece. The perception is totally different. So my view, my personal view, is that we should stop trying to have something all together. My view is that we have to take a few countries, willing and capable, as it has been clearly stated in the treaty, in the European treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, who can share some common objective to which they can point using their resources in an inclusive way. So the answer to the question is that it is possible, not at 27, but it requires the goodwill of the major countries, which is not granted. I mean, the view in Paris and the view in Rome and the view in Berlin is different. And we must be able, we the French and the Germans, to put aside our differences and just to define some objective, maybe not the global objectives, but some objectives towards which we can have the idea of putting together our military resources in order to support the common policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Enzo. Thank you for drawing our attention on the problems we stands before, which is the need to have a common, an authentic common foreign policy before you actually can have a defense dimension or a common defense. I could not agree more. You also pointed out to the possibilities of moving forward with a certain degree of flexibility. This is possible with the rules that we have. And I wonder whether Lorenzo could elaborate on this notion of flexibility, together with other consideration around the difficulties and the conditions needed to develop a defense policy. Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ferdinando. And thank you very much for the invitation. Lucio De Michele, the head of the policy planning unit, wasn't able to be here today, but he sends to the organizer, to all of you, his best greetings. I remember that was probably 2018. At the time, the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, in his State of the Union speech, titled, if I well remember, the hour of European sovereignty, and I quote, he said, "It is time to Europe to develop the capacity to play a role as a union in shaping global affairs. Europe has to become a more sovereign actor in international relations." It was 2018, so a few years ago. And it was quite an ambitious plan, I would say. But also I remember something different. It was a few years earlier. It was 1993, the same year the Maastricht Treaty entered into force, and with it also it was the launch of the common foreign and security policy that was quite important for the external action of the European Union that was created with the Maastricht Treaty. There was a European scholar, Christopher Hill, who warned about the so-called capability expectation gap. That was 1993. His thesis was quite simple. There is a gap in the European Union between what the European Union is, or at least on what you would like to do internationally, and its capabilities. So this is a sort of structural gap between what you can do and between what you would do and what you actually can do. And I think that after 30 years, we are more or less, with some differences that now I would like to highlight, we are dealing with the same gap. With some differences, as I said, because I think that the world has changed compared to the 90s, and we should consider more aspects to depict at the general level the current situation, because I think that if we desire at the European level to take political and diplomatic initiative or to launch military and civilian operation and missions, we need, of course, proper capabilities. Il on that was absolutely right. There are no doubts, but probably something is missing in his thesis. We need, I would say, two more theoretical conditions. The first one is the capacity, is quite obvious, to take a decision, because and in the European Union, in a 27 member states European Union, these should not be taken for granted, because if we want to use our capabilities, first of all, we have to take the decision and to take a direction. And I just remind you that, for example, in the common foreign security policy, veto power apply. So, you know, decisions sometimes can be quite problematic. The second condition is the independence from external decision. If we are obliged to follow and sometimes suffer the decision of the others, well, probably we are not so autonomous, because of course there is, I think, a strong link between what we're talking today and the bigger debate about the so-called European strategic autonomy or European strategic sovereignty. Of course, there is a strong link between the desire for the European Union to be more present on the international scene, to be more active, and at the same time to be more autonomous from other decisions, to be more autonomous to do something alone. So, to recap, first of all, we need the capacity to take decision. The second way, we need the capacity to be independent from others' decision. And last but not least, as Hill wrote in 1993, the capacity to implement decision, namely the capabilities to do what we want. So as you see, probably the picture is even more complicated compared to the past. But to give you now today a sort of political and diplomatic perspective on this topic, I would like to put on the table 4 challenges on the road towards a European strategic autonomy, and more precisely toward a stronger geopolitical role for the European Union. Probably it would sound as a sort of recap of what we already heard, especially from General Camporini, but also from the previous panelists. But I stress the nature of these challenges as a number of trade-off, or a sort of diplomatic and political dilemma that we have to deal with them. We cannot escape from this trade-off. The first one, I think, is Atlantism versus Europeism. Here, of course, the important point is the central, and I would add the essential role played by the alliance between the US and the European Union, and of course the role of NATO in this important alliance. In many theaters, we know that very well. Europe cannot act alone. I think that Afghanistan remind us this problem recently. And of course, the Euro-Atlantic Alliance cannot be questioned for many other reasons, especially in the competitive world we are experiencing now. At the same time, I think that this relationship may become problematic. Just one word, AUKUS. Okay, so I think that sometimes this relationship, and also I refer about the triangle, United States, European Union, and NATO, may represent sometimes, of course, this is an open question, a complication in developing a common EU defense. The second trade-off and dilemma is technical versus political integration. What I mean, if we look at the history of the European integration, we notice that many times political impasses have been solved technically. What I mean, usually, you know, when there was a problem, negotiator tried to find a sort of, let's call them a technical solution to depoliticize a divisive issue. So that was a quite important instrument, a quite important tool to push forward the European integration project. Okay, and I think that in the last year, with the European Defense Fund, with the permanent structure cooperation, and also with other initiatives like CARD, we work a lot on the technical side. Of course, there were important implications at the political level, but for what concerns decision-making process, and I remind you that important criteria about the capacity to take decision, well, on that probably at the European Union level, we didn't work so much. We should do probably in the future, think more about that, and at least we should try to do more on that side, on the political side. The third dilemma that I present to you today is ambition versus inclusion. The size of a group matters. okay? And especially when we deal with different perspectives and perceptions, as General Camporini described before. Talking about the EU, I think that the more member states are involved, the more divergency will probably emerge. And just to give you another example, PESCO, so the Permanent Structured Cooperation, that was probably the case. Okay, the original idea in the Lisbon Treaty about this type of cooperation was probably different from what we have now. So the original idea was probably referred to a small group of states, more integrated, more with a different political will to go forward on this defense cooperation. The last trade-off, and then I will stop, is aspiration versus realism. Of course, we have to think big or we have to be realistic on our proposal. I think that you got the dilemma on these, and especially if you know something about EU negotiation, I think that this is something quite common. And again, where we have different perceptions, different political wills, you know, we have to find a compromise also on these points. So I think that if we want to work in the future, in the next years today, for a stronger and more integrated EU common defense, we have to deal with all these trade-offs and dilemma. There is no alternative, and we have to find a compromise for each of them. Italy is at the front line on this effort. We support the concept of strategic autonomy. We have supported PESCO. We are part of many PESCO projects. We, in the past, in the recent year, we every time supported any proposal on a stronger EU defense. So, of course, Italy is a part of the game, is completely involved to give its contribution to find a compromise for each of these trade-offs. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Now I would make a procedural proposal. We've had a first round of intervention by the panelists. I would like to ask you if you have questions, curiosity, if you want to ask, don't hesitate, please raise your hands, and then we can have a second round of short intervention. I don't know what is our deadline. Giorgio, could you tell us when should we end this? 5? No. Okay, so we have time, please. Can you introduce yourself before you speak? And maybe if you can take off the mask. So,
good afternoon.
Thank you.
I'm Giulia, I'm Italian. And my question is about the topic about European sovereignty. And my question was about what are the major changes that should we take to achieve that? Like, what are the things that should be done and the major changes? Thank you.
Big question. Please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Beatriz. I come from Brazil. I'm a second-year student of global governance. And my question is to Mr. Vincenzo Camporini. I would like to ask if you could develop a bit more about when you mentioned that one of the strategies that can be taken, it's to European countries create, what was the name? Let's say regional, smaller joint forces, because in my view, isn't it a way of actually deepen the division inside of the European Union? Thank you.
Other questions? Please.
Good afternoon, my name is Ekbel and I'm a second-year student of global governance, and my question would be connected to Beatrice's one. So creating a regional or in general a European Union wouldn't, except for the differences, I would say, wouldn't it blend the personality of each state and also slower the process and the action by bureaucratization and in general diplomatic process.
Thank you. There. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Valerio Nejumi, a second-year global governance student from Roma Tor Vergata. And my question would regard the concept of defense. So should we think about it in a military way? Should we invest more in diplomacy? And since we are thinking in peace, in something, in no conflicts, in a future that hopefully will be based on peace. So how much should we invest on diplomacy rather than on, I don't know, military means? Thank you.
Thank you. No other questions? If not, but before giving the floor to the panelists, I'd like to add one personal consideration, which was inspired to me by the last question or remark. It is true that when judging the performance of the European Union in the national scene, foreign policy and defense count. They are important, but they are not the only dimension which really counts. And when looking at European sovereignty as a concept in general, please do consider that there are other common policies that contribute to define EU's identity in the international scene. And I would like to draw your attention on a few examples. Take, for instance, trade policy, where on trade, we are the protagonist, and we are a very strong and important, we, I mean the European Union, I speak on behalf of the Union, for the very simple reason that this is an exclusive competence of the Union, where the Commission acts based on a mandate by the member states, but can act sufficiently in a sufficiently autonomous manner. Take, for instance, climate. There is no other country or group of countries which has taken a lead in the international scene in the context of climate change. We have set in Europe the most ambitious targets, and we're trying to lead by example. And we're now implementing measures within Europe to make these targets reachable, practicable. So I would like to, and I stop here because that would be too long, when looking at the EU in general and the EU projection in the international scene, don't limit yourself at defense, where actually we are very weak, as many of you said in the debate we had so far. Look at the more general picture. Now, I would like to give the floor for some reaction to our speakers, and I started with Mr. Brennan from Washington, please.
Well, thank you so much, and I couldn't agree more with your last comment. That I think part of the Washington frustration is that we see the EU as an increasingly important, powerful player on the global stage, yet the security element is not matched by the power that the EU has on the economic and trade side. I think just to address some of the questions about how to Europe, why European sovereignty matters. And one specific example that comes to mind was when I was in the State Department and France began operations in the Sahel. They quickly realized that they had an issue, which they needed US military support. They needed, the US has air tankers. We have that basically are flying gas stations that enable French fighter jets or American fighter jets to refuel, to constantly be operating. We also have surveillance drones, ISR, that can provide clear vision of the battle space. In France, despite being one of the most powerful military in continental Europe, didn't have enough of these assets or capabilities to actually maintain its operations. And so they came to the US, and we had to make a decision in the State Department and the Defense Department whether to provide this support. Now, normally, so in order to provide this emergency support, we had to take money from a fund that is normally devoted for sort of emergencies involving pretty much poor countries. Think, crisis in Syria or along the Turkish border, and we're going to provide aid in the terms of military support or any sort of humanitarian assistance. And there's a cap on how much money we could actually use. And we ended up agreeing to support France, but it was a controversial decision because France is a very wealthy country. And normally we wouldn't have taken money from this fund to support a wealthy country. And I think that's part of the frustration. And I think when we talk about European sovereignty, to me, it is about developing some of the capabilities that the US military has that are the enabling capabilities. So, when we think of the US military and all its kind of awesome might, the real secret is that it is an incredible logistics operation, that it has the ability to get troops over to the other side of the world very quickly. And when we talk about the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think it's important to separate two different things. One was how we withdrew and the nature of the collapse of the Afghan government. But then we did a humanitarian intervention at Hamid Karzai Airport, where we sent in thousands of troops after we had pulled them out. But we sent in thousands of troops, occupied an airport, and got more than 100,000 people out in what was actually an incredibly successful humanitarian operation. And to the last question about why defense matters, well, as EU citizens, most of you there, that the EU has certain responsibilities to you, and to come to your aid, to come to your rescue. And there was a case in Afghanistan where the United States was the only one able to actually do that mission. And there is no reason for the EU not to be able to conduct those operations. And a final point I would make is that the EU spends collectively 200 billion euros on defense. That is enough to make the EU a major military power, or at least a military power capable enough to deploy a few thousand forces to hold an airport. But the EU doesn't currently have that capability. And to me, one of the major innovations that has actually occurred over the last 2 years is with the next gen EU, with the EU's ability to borrow money, creates, I think, a potential avenue for EU defense. That the only real way to create EU defense integration, I think, is that if there is real investment in it. And I don't see any reason why the EU, if it values defense and security as a priority, couldn't borrow more money, just as it's doing on the EU defense, on Next Gen EU with AAA credit ratings, and begin to make investments, maybe not in the lethal capabilities, but in the enabling capabilities, the air transport, the air tankers, that then could enable the EU to operate and act without the United States. And I think this is frankly in America's interest to have a more capable European partner. And I think it would actually mean that the United States begins to take Europe more seriously, and not as countries that aren't sort of living up to our requests when it comes to defense and security. So I think there's a lot of ways to kind of plot a new course on EU defense and security. I think this is not a sort of short-term issue. It's something that we need to sort of plot. Europe needs to plot a new direction, and it will take multiple decades to get there, to have a more autonomous and capable European security force. But I think it's time now to have this real conversation where you have an administration here in Washington that is sort of open to a new direction.
Thank you. Teresa Coratello, please.
Thank you. I would like to react on the question regarding what we need to do for a sovereignty, for a stronger European sovereignty. And to answer these questions, I would like to start from a daily life problem. Today, if you want to buy a car in Italy, and I know by personal experience of this weekend, you need to wait it is probably you will wait 1 year, 10 months, 1 year. Why? Because we don't receive, the Italian companies, I don't want to go into details, the chips and semiconductor from Malaysia in order to make your car and build your car. Why this? Because we are now facing a kind of, I don't want competition, let's say, by using very diplomatic words between the US and China, and we as Italy and Europe, and I'm really describing this in very general terms, are suffering from this. We're not receiving these chips, the semiconductors, so our companies cannot order cars to be sent in Italy and to be bought by Italian buyers. Why I'm saying this? This is a practical and quite funny, not for me, example of what does it mean to be in the middle of a more geopolitical, a more global competition between actors which today are finding some difficulties in talking to each other and connecting with each other. So what is need to be done to be more sovereignty? First of all, I mean, apart from making very important political proclaims and having long-term vision and a strategy, according to me, Europe today, first of all, needs to be able also to protect itself from this kind of situation, to be able to react in an active way as a player and not only as one of the interlocutors in the current scenario, which I can assure you is very far from what I used to live in when I was at the university. It's much more difficult than 10 years ago. One second thing that Europe could do is to strengthen what is at the very core of European action and strategy, dialoguing and building strategic partnership with our neighborhood. And we are Italian, some of us are not. Italy is located in the very middle of the Mediterranean, and Sicily is not very different from our the northern Mediterranean neighborhood. We are all part of the same regional dimension. We have the North Africa at the south, we have the Balkan close to us as well. So what Europe should do as well is to continue in its action of strengthening what has already been done since the creation of the European Union, in order to have our partners involved in what is strategic for us, but also for them. And my very last point on trade, on green, and to lead by example. This is a very concrete example of how Europe is acting as a sovereign actor. The Green Deal is something we never faced as European in our past. Believe us, I know that you've been listening to this for days and for months, also during your university studies. But what we are doing with the Green Deal, with our economic potential, it's something that Europe never had the opportunity to deal with. Being a green sovereign actor means being able to involve some particular and difficult interlocutor. I think about Turkey, for example. By using your green sovereignty, you can dialogue with Turkey, you can involve Turkey in your project, and you can make the most in order to keep Turkey, Turkish citizens, Turkey business closer to us. So it really, I know that with regard to defense and security, the situation might not look as bright as we would like to have it, but we can assure you that Europe, and as a sovereign actor, is really playing well. what Europe can do is to play its card at its best, more on specific dossier, where we as a major economic power can really make the difference.
Thank you, Vincenzo.
I was sure that my idea of having a smaller group of countries to take the lead in this field was going to raise some question marks. But in the history of the European Union, you have other examples. Schengen did not start altogether. The euro is a common currency only for a few, for not all the countries. So there is no contradiction, and it may well be the initial kickoff in order to make a step forward. If this is not done, and we still are bound by the concept of the decisions taken unanimously, we will go really nowhere. I would like to take this opportunity also to challenge one of the question of Mr. Vai, the issue about Atlanticism versus Europeism. I don't see any contradiction whatsoever. I believe that we have across the Atlantic a number of issues, of solid issues, gigantic issues, which keep us together. But we Europeans can contribute and support the Euro-Atlantic community only if we have the capabilities and the willingness to do that in a consistent way. We claim that the US have not been consulting us during these contingencies. Why should they consult us? Why? They do not need us. We were there because we wanted to be there. There was a moral obligation, but not a political obligation. But if we Europeans have the capabilities, the willingness, and the common sharing of the objectives to reach, then Europe would be more likely listened by Washington. And Washington would be more likely to ask us and to inform us and to take decisions with us and not over us. Thank you.
Thank you, Enzo. Sorry for the interruption, but I need it. Lorenzo, your last.
Yeah, just to be clear, of course, I agree with Vincenzo. I think that there is no position between Atlantism and Europeism, and this is also your official position of Italy, of course. I mean, for Italy, the collaboration between NATO and the European Union is, of course, essential. The two international organizations have to work together, and actually a more autonomous European Union is an added value for NATO too and for United States. So in this sense, of course, there is a sort of convergence between the interests of the European Union to develop more autonomous capacities and the United States that for many years, since many years is asking more involved European Union and especially more European member states in NATO operation, but not only NATO operation, more in defense expenditures. I would like to tackle the first question again, because I would like to add something on that, because I think it is at the heart of this debate, giving again a sort of diplomatic perspective on that. Because in Brussels, of course, strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty has become in the last 2 years, I would say, a sort of buzzword. Everybody talk about that in any type of meetings, on the newspapers, but also within the institution. We talk a lot about that. First of all, there was, for example, a problem about definition. And about the use of different words, because probably autonomy means something, sovereignty means something else. And for a group of member states, I'm not going to name them, but let's say from Eastern Europe, for example, talking about European sovereignty was an issue. Because with the word sovereignty, you know, there are also implications for national sovereignty, especially if we talk about defense. We are at the pillar, at the heart of national sovereignty. If we, for example, suppose the creation of a European army, okay, it's just a fantasy, it's a dream, of course, it's not gonna happen. We'll see, but not gonna happen in short and medium term. Well, we will have an existential change in the European Union project. The creation of the European army would change everything, also the same nature of the member states. So that's the problem with the concept of sovereignty, but it's a sort of two-level game, because I think that Teresa lists a good example of what today means sovereignty at the European level. But as I said, it's a two-level game. We have, at the first level, we have to understand how to be more autonomous in different fields. I mean, the list is quite long. Today we talk about defense, but I could mention, for example, energy, okay, which is quite important. Think about EU-Russia relations on this. Think about vaccine. There was another problem during pandemic. And the technology, financial system, you know, the list is quite long. So first of all, we have to understand in which field and how to deal with that internationally. But there is also another level of this game, which is probably more problematic, I would say, is the internal game. So how the different member states, first of all, they have to define a sort of European interest, a sort of European common position on energy, on defense, you know. And I think that we already elaborate a bit at this point. At the same time, there is another problem: how to pursue that that European interest. In which way? In many cases, the best way, and there are many examples in the past, is because we have to be clear on that, sometimes to give more power to Brussels, because we need more coordination, because we need a better and stronger capacity to take decision all together, to act as a group, okay? And so when we think about transfer of power from national capitals to Brussels, we touch a very sensitive point. So this is, of course, again, at the theoretical level, probably the biggest problem when we talk about strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty. And defense is, of course, again, at the heart of this debate.
So I think with this, we may consider as concluded our meetings. We've been very respectful of the time frame which was given to us. I thank all the panelists for their contribution to this conversation, and all of you for being with us today. Congratulations also for the gender balance. I see almost only women, also you have reached an incredible standard in terms of gender balance. Are you with the Tor Vergata University, the Global Governance course? I will have to congratulate Gustavo Piga. Thank you, bye-bye.